Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the Tewksbury Genealogy Group May 2023 meeting, which is open to all. I say Tewksbury, but we're in the age of Zoom, open to all. Tonight, I've entitled the talk, How I Used Genealogical Research and DNA Testing to Find My Birth Parents. Tonight's featured speaker is author Rebecca Daniels. With almost no information on her genetic heritage, adoptee Rebecca Daniels followed limited clues and used DNA testing, genealogical research, thoughtful letter writing, and a willingness to make awkward phone calls with strangers to finally find her birth parents. Rebecca will offer a presentation and a brief reading on her new book, Finding Sisters: How One Adoptee Used DNA Testing and Determination to Uncover Family Secrets and Find Her Birth Family. And we again thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring. So all 52 or so who are watching live, and I suspect the other 52 that will watch the recording on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Rebecca for joining us this evening. And Rebecca, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. Okay. So I knew, I don't remember ever not knowing that I was adopted, but I knew that I was wanted, that I'd been chosen, and I never felt a really strong urge to find my biological kin. I did get a diagnosis when I was a teenager that I had a hereditary eye disease, and I was encouraged to do genetic testing if I ever wanted children. Well, my first husband did not, literally gave me the choice, abortion or divorce, when I thought I might be pregnant early in our marriage. Thankfully, I didn't have to make that choice because I wasn't pregnant, and I eventually did divorce the guy. Then I lived alone for about 15 years, and by the time I married my second husband, my childbearing years were over. So there was really no need for genetic testing for childbearing purposes. About almost 10 years ago, a good friend asked me to do DNA testing with her. It seemed more urgent for her. She was biracial and really wanted to explore the white part of her family that she had never known growing up. And so we chose Family Tree DNA Services, probably because there was a sale. I don't know, I don't remember what went into our decision. But at first, after we started getting some results, my friend got really frustrated because as soon as she identified as Black, the white relatives didn't seem to want to contact her. So she kind of walked away from the whole enterprise. And I never got much in the way of close matches. And I really didn't have any idea what else to do about that testing. It had been really quite a lark for me. So the first year, a lot of very distant cousins showed up, but I had very little information to share with them. And so nothing really happened. And then the action started. And even once things really heated up in the search, there are several gaps where nothing new happened. It's a stop and start kind of journey, this genetic testing business. So, as I mentioned, the earliest matches were all usually third to fifth cousins or even more distant. And I had only one surname to share. Now, for the purposes of the book, I did not share those names with the public because my writing group suggested that the names were more confusing than they were worth, because I wasn't really writing about people finding me. I was writing about my journey. So whenever I reference surnames, I'll be using just an initial. So I had an inquiry almost a year after the first test from a fellow in Sweden named Thomas. He was sure I was part of his extended family, probably a distant cousin to his Aunt Kirsten, and he called it deep in time. And that it turned out over the long haul that he was a sixth cousin on the maternal side. And he believed that the connection was likely from a city called Karlskoga in the province of Värmland near the Sweden-Norway border. Now, this was all pretty startling to me because I had no idea what to expect. And he was so intense and excited that there was this connection. I didn't know what to do. So I called a good friend, member of my family, and shared that there was this guy who had all this information he wanted to share with me. And I asked her because I knew she'd done a lot of genealogical research, most of it along traditional lines. She was a former librarian. But I asked, she said, okay, I have a few questions for you. Has he asked you for money? No, he hasn't. Has he said anything to you that makes you uncomfortable? No, he hasn't. It's all kind of exciting, in fact. Well, then she said, he's probably just a genealogy nut and likes to help people find their relatives, like all the rest of us. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and got back in touch with Thomas. And he said that he was experienced with genealogy, both from his personal sort of genealogical research and the fact that he was a chemist working in a genetics lab. But he also told me he couldn't help himself, so he checked out the name I'd given him from my pre-adoption paperwork. And I had been a baby Jane Doe G. And he found a wedding certificate for a Glenna G, dated 3 months after my birth in Bremerton, Washington. He suggested I ought to explore this possible connection. So for the next month, between mid-February and mid-March, Thomas helped me find more details about Glenna G, adding to the possibility that she could be my birth mother, including a current address and phone for her in Omaha, Nebraska. And Robert, will you share image 2, please? So this is a picture of Glenna G when she was a senior in high school, which was just, her graduation was just a few months before I was born. Okay, we don't need the photo anymore. But whoops, but I do need my notes back. There we go. So given that I had this address and phone number for Omaha and the information I'd been given suggested that there was a niece also living in Massachusetts named Barbara. So I contacted Barbara, who was a retired academic like I was, and I wrote a note to Glenna. Now, I knew it, I'd read enough about adoption reunions that I didn't want to freak her out because so many people have different responses to being found or to finding their genetic family. So instead of saying, hey, I think you might be my mom, I merely used the phrase, I think we might be related. So before the end of the month of March, I heard from Barbara, setting up a lunch date, and from a woman named April, who identified herself as Glenna's daughter, saying she knew about the child given away and wanted more connection with me. So I met cousin Barbara at a restaurant halfway between our homes. I live in Turners Falls. She lives much closer to Boston. So we had a lovely lunch, and she confirmed a strong family resemblance. But that didn't mean very much to me because people always used to say I looked like my adoptive dad and that my brother, also adopted, looked like our mom. So people kind of see what they want to see sometimes, though eventually I couldn't deny the physical resemblance. So April agreed that she would she would make sure that Glenna did a DNA test, which I sent to them. And then the results came in, confirmed that Glenna was indeed my mother. So we planned an in-person reunion for several months in the future. And we didn't do it right away because I needed a major surgery. And we determined that while Glenna had dementia, she was in her middle 80s, she was otherwise healthy. So postponing was possible. And that would allow me to recoup from my surgery. So I met Glenna and April in September of 2015. And Robert, if you would show the image number 3, please. And this is our little family portrait. And most people who've looked at that say, yeah, we look like a family. There are a lot of physical similarities. So clearly, April and I both got many of our physical characteristics from our shared mother. Okay, we don't need the photo anymore. And now I'm going to read you a scene from the book, from the chapter 4 called In Person. This is about that reunion. I couldn't sleep as easily as usual. I'd just spent an entire day traveling to another time zone, finishing with a harrowing drive in a car I didn't know well at night in a big city I'd never been in before, Omaha, Nebraska. All the hopeful excitement I'd felt on the plane had evaporated quickly. Despite detailed directions, I'd gotten lost between the airport and my hotel and had to retrace my steps a couple of times, making me acutely aware of my worsening night blindness. Lucky for me, none of those misadventures were on major freeways. I got that part right, though I'm sure I drove the drivers behind me crazy for going too slow for the traffic flow. It was the local arterial streets that confused me, and the fact that the hotel was located in what seemed like an uninhabited industrial park. Or it might have been the rain, which made it hard to see the street signs. When I finally got to the Super 8, where I'd booked a room, I was relieved, and my tension started to unwind as I approached the check-in desk. However, the night desk clerk refused to give me the price I'd committed to online because that sale was no longer in effect, and quoted me a price much higher than the one I'd budgeted for when I booked the room. I argued that the summer sale had been in effect and showed my reservation receipt with the price on it that had no sign of an expiration date. I even threatened to find another hotel, though I knew there was no way I'd be going out again in this dreary September night. All sense of relief and relaxation I'd felt on arrival, however minimal it had been, vanished. And I started to feel the sharp edge of a sudden grief eruption, an almost visceral pang I hadn't experienced in a long time. The clerk would never have treated Skip that way. That's my deceased husband, by the way. I was able to hold it inside, but I expect my voice by then was showing signs of what a friend has called my brittle tone. At my insistence, the clerk called for his manager, who immediately gave me the room at the price I expected. Perhaps she could tell I was on the verge of tears, or perhaps it was the cane I still needed to walk any distance after my surgery. Or perhaps she was being a smart manager and trying to keep a customer happy. But by that time, even getting the price I'd expected did little to calm me down. What I needed was a stiff drink, which was nowhere to be found in this isolated location. Not even a mini bar. The night before leaving home, I'd made myself a double Manhattan for courage and tried to imagine what Skip might have said to me about this journey if he'd still been alive. He had always been such a good travel companion, and all the frustrations of this day made me miss him even more than the usual dull heartache I felt every day. It was now well past midnight in my unfamiliar cookie-cutter motel room, but some yoga breathing and a cup of herbal tea helped me relax and focus on what would happen in the morning, and I fell into a much-needed deep sleep. After I'd talked with April in the spring of 2015 about coming to meet her and Glenna in the fall, I'd experienced a whirlwind month, finishing up my professional obligations, attending my nephew's college graduation out in Colorado, followed by a major surgery and a very slow-paced and body-focused 3 months where I concentrated on convalescing after a full hip replacement. That recovery had been going well. I was gaining back my strength slowly but surely, and I could drive again after 6 weeks of depending on others for transportation. In mid-August, I determined I would be strong enough to travel in a few weeks, so April and I had set a date for my Omaha visit. At first, my newfound cousins, Barbara and Tish, had planned to join me, both to see April and Glenna, with whom they hadn't visited since before Glenna's stroke, and because of their interest in their family genealogy. But then Tish had an unexpected health crisis, so Barbara decided she needed to wait for her sister to get better before going out to Omaha. So I was traveling alone. April wanted me to stay at their house and had suggested she would give up her own room to me, but everything I'd read about reunion experiences told me to be sure I had my own private space to decompress after each day of visiting. I told April I appreciated the offer, but that I didn't want to inconvenience her and had asked her for some recommendations on hotels close to their house. That's how I found myself in this seemingly remote Super 8, though in the morning light, I discovered it was a conference hotel for several large nearby industrial parks, as well as being close to Omaha's downtown and Glenna and April's more suburban-feeling neighborhood. I'd also given myself an escape plan if things went south with the reunion. I had close friends that I hadn't seen in many years who lived in Grand Island, Nebraska, about 2 hours west of Omaha. I was scheduled to visit with them for the weekend after spending a few days during the week in Omaha, but I knew that if the first reunion day was dreadful, they would welcome me early and would be a terrific help in processing what I'd experienced, no matter when I arrived. The rain had cleared up by morning, and I had a short and very easy drive over to Glenna and April's house on a quiet street full of houses with nice yards on modest-sized lots, a few hedges and fences, but with a welcoming feel to the whole area, which helped to calm my nerves a bit. April had warned me that the house was on a corner and the driveway was on the cross street, not the street in the address she had given me. So concentrating on finding the right house kept me from worrying about anything else. When I pulled into the driveway of a small ranch house with a fenced yard on one side and open landscaping on the other, the garage door opened almost immediately, and an energetic woman a few years younger than I, wearing jeans, a loose, colorful top, short curly hair, and a big smile, came bustling out to greet me. April enveloped me in a warm hug as soon as I got out of the car, and it felt good to know this welcoming person was my half-sister. We had arranged to meet early so we could talk and get used to each other a bit before Glenna woke up. As we entered the house through the double garage, April showed me all the boxes she'd arranged to have carried up from the basement to folding tables in the empty bay, so I could go through their contents while I was visiting. We were hoping to find a little more about both my birth father and perhaps more about Glenna's background as well. But she spent most of her time during the day caring for Glenna's needs and rarely had the energy for sleuthing in the basement in the evenings, so the job of going through these boxes would be mine. April thought her grandmother Flora had kept journals, but she hadn't had a chance to go through the memorabilia that had been in storage since coming to Glenna after Flora's death. Seeing those boxes for the first time gave me a jolt of visceral excitement. Perhaps my story would be somewhere in their contents. As it had been on the phone, the conversation was easy between us, and April and I continued to share more details about our lives over coffee in the living room of this cozy little house. with many family photos, gingham curtains, and charming country-style knickknacks all around, including a porcelain shepherdess and some animal figurines. A friendly small white dog and a tricolored cat completed the picture of domestic coziness and tranquility. As we talked, April shared more details about Glenna's medical situation. In addition to dementia, she suffered from sundowner syndrome, which meant that she often got upset and agitated in the late afternoon for no obvious reason, and was much more herself in the morning hours. April told me that Glenna was both excited and nervous about meeting me, and that she was very glad I had discovered her after all these years. I confessed to feeling the same. After about an hour of comfortable conversation, it was time for April to get Glenna up for the day. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I'd seen several photos and heard lots of anecdotes about my birth mother, but now I was going to find out who she was in person. Though my insides were still tense, I felt a strange calm come over me as I waited in the kitchen and family room area of the house. I could hear the murmur of April's voice as she helped Glenna get up and dressed for the day, which seemed soothing for both of us. Soon, a frail, elderly woman wearing a purple flowered house dress and a shy smile pushed her walker into the room. She stopped when she saw me, and April, who was right behind her, introduced us. Glenna didn't speak, but kept on smiling and nodding as April reminded her who I was. With my heart pounding and an answering smile on my face, I moved closer and took her hand, telling her I was so very glad to meet her. She held on tight and just kept smiling. She was looking at me like she was trying to memorize every detail of my face. April told Glenna that she needed to get seated in her recliner so we could all talk and get to know each other, and thus the reunion with my birth mother began. I knew that mornings were Glenna's best, most lucid times, but I didn't want to push too hard for information, especially on that first day. So I started by telling her a bit about my adoptive parents and what a good life I'd had with them, thanking her for giving me to such a good family. It felt like cliche after cliche coming out of my mouth, but Glenna seemed to appreciate knowing that her oldest child had been well cared for. So I didn't worry about trying to find more original ways to describe my life to her. April had told me Glenna's eating habits were erratic, so I was happy to discover that my presence didn't affect her appetite, at least not on that first day. We shared a modest meal together, and I was happy to notice that Glenna was able to feed herself with no trouble. The stroke had not taken that ability away, even though it had claimed much of her memory. When I returned to my hotel room in the evening to try to process the experience and to make notes about any and all information about my family background, this was how I wrote about our first day together. Quote, "What a day. I don't feel particularly articulate at the moment, but there are a few words I can use to describe what happened today. It was sweet. We were all nervous, but very accepting of each other right away. Rather sad. I wish I'd found her before dementia did, but I did see flashes of what she must have been like when younger. And generally quite wonderful to start building relationships with new family members. I know these kinds of reunions can be tricky, but here's hoping tomorrow and Friday go as well as today did." End quote. And they did. What I wrote on the second evening revealed just how well they were going. Quote, "We had another remarkable day today. Though her dementia still presents us with some challenges, more of the story emerged today. Glenna seemed more at ease with me, and April and I continued to get more and more comfortable with each other. Things I've learned in the past couple of days from a combination of old journals and current conversations. 1, Glenna went to South Dakota State, where there were lots of World War II veterans in her classes, but my birth father was not among them. She met him at a local dance. She said he was a pilot, though she didn't know what kind, because she never went up with him, and that he ended up marrying a girl who looked just like her, about which she seemed quite proud. 2, she went to Bremerton, Washington, where I was born, to live with her Aunt Rachel, and while she was there, she took classes at the Bremerton Business College. Whether before or after she had me and gave me up is not clear. And though there's a clear family resemblance between me and April, it seems I resemble my deceased half-sister Penny most of all, right down to our looks, gestures, and even our interests. It's all pretty amazing." End quote. These conversations with Glenna exist in my memory in a kind of a jumble. Each of the 3 days I was in Omaha, we spent the mornings talking about our shared history and connections. They were rather disjointed conversations, with April trying to fill in some details she and Glenna had discussed in earlier years about the baby girl who'd been given away. Each time April tried to bring up my birth father, Glenna would burst into tears, so we stopped talking about it. It wasn't evident whether she was crying because she forgot his name, whether he wasn't very nice to her, or for some other unknown reason. It's possible he never even knew she was pregnant, since she was sent immediately after that discovery to her aunt's house in Washington State. These conversations involved an interesting memory book that Glenna had started for April when they were both younger, but never completed, and which April would use as a point to start each new topic of conversation. The book that Glenna bought years earlier had various memory cues for each page and lots of blank spaces to be filled in by the person completing the book for her child. The memory book Glenna made for April had lots of interesting details that added to the picture I was getting of the woman who'd borne me. And when April read from the book, I caught a glimpse now and then of the younger and more vivacious Glenna through a smile or a laugh or a quick sideways glance at me. She had been named for the golfer Glenna Collette, a famous lady golfer in the early 20th century that her mother Flora had admired, even though neither mother nor daughter had ever played golf. What little Glenna had been told about her own birth parents was included as well. Little sidebar, I was the adopted child of an adopted child. So think about that, genealogically speaking. So Glenna had been told a little bit about her own birth family. Her birth mother had supposedly worked in some capacity, or had worked in some capacity at the hospital where Glenna had been born, though she had never known for sure what the job had been. Her ethnicity was supposedly Irish, with the surname S, and her father had been identified as Welsh, with the surname W. Family lore suggested that Glenna's genetic father had been the son of a wealthy landowner, and her mother had worked for the family in some kind of domestic position, perhaps as a maid, which made marriage between them impossible. My first experience with Glenna's sundowner syndrome was sad to observe, but not as upsetting as I feared, perhaps due to the fact that I had already seen my adoptive mother through late-stage Alzheimer's disease. The episodes came on without warning in the middle or late afternoon. While Glenna sobbed, she self-soothed with rocking motions and repetitive gestures, including pulling at her socks or the neck of her dress and rubbing her knees, and she became almost totally nonverbal, in stark contrast to her soft-spoken but somewhat halting conversations earlier in the day. I sat with her through some of this, but did not write about it at the time. On the second and third mornings of my visit, I had coffee with April while Glenna was still sleeping, and then went to work exploring the contents of the boxes in the garage, which I cataloged for all of us. There were 7 large boxes and a large shopping bag full of postcards, photos, travel memorabilia, most likely for scrapbooking that never happened. Unfortunately, all I got from the boxes was a headache from the dust and mold on the contents. It turned out that most of what was in those boxes were Flora's materials from many years of teaching math and science at Redfield High School, and little or nothing of personal import. What little genealogical information they contained was about Flora's family of origin, compiled by her father. though there were a few uncaptioned photos of Glenna and others in one of the scrapbooks. I left a copy of my list of the contents with April and sent one to Barb and Tish, but we were all quite disappointed not to find Flora's journals or to get a more personal sense of family history in her own words. April remained convinced they were somewhere in the house, but we didn't have time to do a more thorough search of the basement while I was visiting, and to my knowledge, April has never found those journals. On Friday afternoon, instead of returning to the hotel at dinner time, I made my goodbyes. Both Glenna and April told me they wished I lived closer so we could see each other more often, and I agreed that it would be nice to see each other again. Then I headed west to visit my friends in Grand Island for the weekend. I hadn't needed to use them as an out, and was happy to report honestly that things had gone very well in Omaha. My friend Teresa, a Methodist minister with excellent pastoral skills, also had the good sense not to push me too hard on what I was feeling about the reunion, but just to ask a few questions about what happened while I was there, like what did we do together? What did we talk about? Teresa and John had 2 children via open adoption, so they were very sensitive to the dynamics around birth families and the emotions those situations can evoke. As I recall, we spent more time talking about how I was adjusting to being a widow than about my new family, since the last time I'd seen them and their youngest daughter, now away at college, had been when all 3 had visited us in northern New York while Skip was still living. They shared their plans to return to Minneapolis as soon as Moselle finished college. So it was a perfect way to relax and unpack my thoughts after a very intense 3 days in Omaha. And my trip home was much less harrowing than the trip to Nebraska had been at the start. Okay, so back to the timeline. About 2 months after the reunion, Glenna's health took a serious downturn, and she died in December 2015, almost exactly 3 months after I was able to meet her. So then we went into a weird hiatus. Very little happened for almost a year after finding Glenna. And during that time, my cousin Thomas in Sweden taught me more about genealogy research. Then there was a bonus that came my way. In early September of 2016, a close relative match appeared on family tree DNA, suggesting it was a first cousin or a half sibling. Thomas suggested the age of the person will make the difference in which relationship it might be, but Anne didn't have a profile or reply to my message at first. Turned out she was on vacation. She'd turned in her DNA and then went off on vacation, hadn't really paid attention, and was at least another week or so after the match popped for me before she realized it had happened. So eventually it became clear that Anne was also adopted, had connections to the region where Glenna had lived before being sent west to her aunts to have the illegitimate child, me. But she had no genetic connection to Glenna, and so wasn't a maternal relative. And she was just a few days younger than me. So Anne knew a bit about her birth mother. She was the product of a one-night stand, she had been told. We figured out that we shared a father, but had no serious clues about who he might be. We started calling him Mr. X. And again, our research became stalled for many more months, finally in frustration, and because I finally realized that if you're in one database, it doesn't mean that they share with each other. So I finally put my DNA in a new database in Ancestry in hopes of finding some new matches. I also went to my 50th high school reunion out in Oregon and was able to meet Anne in person because she lived relatively close to where I was staying in a Portland suburb. So Robert, could you share us image 4, please? So this is me with my sister Anne, paternal half-sister. Okay, so you can kill the image. We'll go back to the story. Oops. So Anne agreed to do a second DNA test with Ancestry. And as if the story wasn't already complicated enough, it got even more complicated at this point. I had all of a sudden a ton of new matches in this new database. Lots of new options started to surface for me. A cousin, Melody, was the first relative to respond actively. She clearly wanted a new relative because of her estrangement from her larger family, and I was the perfect thing for her at the time. But because of the estrangement, her siblings rejected me, told her they thought I was a scam artist, though it's never clear what they think I was looking for. I just wanted some answers, but apparently they didn't believe that I wasn't out to take their money for some reason. So a couple of weeks later, it turned out that Anne, who had tested after I did, had no genetic connections at all to the matches I was finding in Melody's clan. So it seems that Melody was connected to Glenna, and we had a bit of information about Glenna's adoptive mother, but nothing about her father. Eventually, it seemed likely that Glenna's birth father was probably Melody's grandfather, though her uncle rejected that idea and absolutely refused a DNA test. So I basically turned to the other Midwestern clan in which I had a lot of genetic matches and started to explore their histories, which turned up two possible candidates for Mr. X, both of whom were pilots. My father was military pilot. The other possibility was a crop duster guy, a rancher. So eventually I found a potential cousin who was willing to do a DNA test, which confirmed that Mr. X was actually her Uncle Bud, who had died when he was 22 in a plane crash, just 18 months after I was born. Not only that, he was on his way to pick up a member of the wedding party for his own wedding. So it's possible Glenna was crying because she knew he was dead and may have seen a photo of his fiance who may or may not have looked just like her, or it may have been something her folks told her to keep her calm when he announced a marriage. But I expect that Bud never even knew I existed. And Robert, will you show us image 5, please? And this is one of the only images that I have of my genetic father. And this was a couple of years before he died. He learned to fly in the Army, flew in Newfoundland. Okay, that's probably enough for that image. And I'm done talking now, so I'm happy to take some questions. Though you probably have figured out that I'm not much of a genealogy expert, and I had a lot of help from people who knew a whole lot more than I knew.
So Rebecca, as we get into the Q&A, I'm going to stop the recording. So just give me one moment.
Okay.